Thank you for joining me. I want to talk today a little bit about moral responsibility in the context of groups. And I'm going to use as illustrations a variety of different uh, ideas from the world of business, and in particular to talk about the ways in which employees in corporations have various modifiers of their moral responsibility in different contexts. Of course, this applies to non-business groups as well. Any hierarchical organization is a setting in which moral responsibility can be modified by virtue of the communal aspect of the organization and by virtue of the hierarchy. But I will be focusing primarily on business hierarchies and business communities, as that seems to me to be the most relevant way to describe these concepts. So if you think about individuals as individuals, qua individuals, it's pretty clear that in circumstances, and most ethicists agree about this sort of thing, in circumstances in which uh, we have no modifiers of our responsibility and our choices are of our own free will, we should be held morally responsible for those choices. If they are good choices, we can be praised. If they are bad choices, we can be blamed. If they are really bad choices, we can be condemned and even criminally penalized if they're very bad choices. That moral responsibility is something that is attributable to us by virtue of the fact that we have freedom in such circumstances. We have the freedom to choose one way or the other. Now we can think of circumstances, though, in which we don't have the freedom to choose one way or another. The famous moral philosopher from ancient times, Aristotle, highlighted two in particular. He highlighted modifiers of our physicality and also modifiers of knowledge. And we can add to that one other, modifiers of the will, which I'll mention briefly. As far as physical coercion goes, for sure, if someone physically coerces you into doing something, you can't be held responsible for that. That seems to be pretty intuitively obvious, and ethicists agree. If you are physically coerced into striking someone so that that person dies as a result of you being physically coerced into hitting them, then you should not be held responsible. However, there is also another form of a modifier of responsibility, and that is a knowledge modifier. So we can imagine circumstances in which our moral responsibility for some bad action might be modified by virtue of the fact that we are ignorant about the nature of the action. Maybe you are in the habit of, let's just take an example from, I don't know, history. Suppose you're the cupbearer to a king, and you are in the habit of bringing him his wine goblet each night. You do so one night, take it to the king's table from the kitchen, and he sips as normal from the wine goblet, pounds his chest, falls over, saying, "I've been poisoned," and dies on the spot. Okay, now you, let's say, had no idea that the goblet was poisoned. You simply took it from the kitchen to the king's table. In such a circumstance, you are ignorant of uh, the nefarious action. You had no criminal intent. There is no mens rea to go along with the actus reus, the criminal action. There's no criminal intent to go along with the criminal action. You should not be held morally responsible. It seems pretty clear. Now, maybe a good cupbearer always samples the wine beforehand, but that is neither here nor there for the example. In circumstances in which we are ignorant of more of what we ought to do, it is harder to hold us morally responsible. At the same time, however, there are different kinds of ignorance. Some forms of ignorance might be called vincible ignorance. That is, ignorance that can be overcome. If we do a little bit of due diligence, scrounge around a little bit to uncover something, then it strikes most ethicists that if it's not too difficult and it's not too hard for you to overcome your ignorance, there is some degree of moral responsibility that you should have by virtue of the fact that you did not make the effort to overcome your ignorance. Now, maybe you have a desire not to overcome your ignorance. You're willfully ignorant. We've perhaps met people who tell us, "I don't want to know," because if I do know about that, then I'm going to be held accountable for it or morally responsible, and people don't want that. In such circumstances, it is often the case, so the ethicists tell us, that we have much greater moral responsibility than we would have if our ignorance were not a product of willful intent. And again, there is invincible ignorance to go along with vincible ignorance. Invincible ignorance is ignorance that you cannot overcome. Many large corporations these days have lots of different moving parts, lots of different wings of the company. And the different parts of the company often don't have much insight into what's going on in the other parts of the company. And if fraud is taking place in one part of the company, let's pick a large bank, J.P. Morgan. Suppose fraud is taking place in the securities wing of J.P. Morgan. The people in personal banking, the people in commercial banking, or maybe an insurance division, they don't know anything about it. They can't even access the computers on the other side of the company to understand that fraud is taking place, nor would there even be any reason for them to do so in their line of work. They have what might be called invincible ignorance. It is not their job. It is not their moral responsibility. Courts of law, according to most business ethics, assessors ought not to hold them morally responsible in the same way that they ought to hold responsible those persons who have or display vincible ignorance. Okay, so we have now two modifiers on the table, physical coercion and also ignorance. But we might add to Aristotle's famous two modifiers of moral responsibility a third modifier of moral responsibility, and that is a modifier that occurs as by virtue of hierarchical organizations. I have children, and when I give my children commands, they're very little children, they don't really have much choice in the matter. They have to obey me. I tell them don't go in the streets, and they really can't question me. They don't have much choice in the matter. They are not allowed to go in the street. End of story, period. That's what Daddy has told them. And in such a circumstance where we are hierarchically organized and we really cannot do otherwise because our will is modified by authority in the hierarchy, most ethicists would agree that we ought not to be held morally responsible, at least not to the same extent. Famously, to give a historical example, famously the high-ranking officials in National Socialist Germany after World War II were put on trial in the city of Nuremberg in Bavaria, and they were tried for war crimes. Numerous war crimes were committed in the course of this reckless and terrible war, including genocide of large numbers of people, gypsies, Jews, disabled persons, and so forth. And in the course of the proceedings in the famous Nuremberg trials, the high-ranking National Socialist officials were asked, why did you do what you did? And almost to a man, they all said, I was following orders. I did my duty. I was doing what I was told to do. And speaking as an ethicist, I buy this explanation. I believe that they truly believed themselves to be following orders. Now, I don't think that that makes them right. I think that there are circumstances where if the orders that we are being given violate the deep moral principles of the universe that we know to be right, then regardless of whether these orders are given by an authority or not, we ought not to follow them. At the same time, though, when authority does tell us to do something, it does modify our will, since there are consequences for disobeying the authority. If my children disobey me and go in the street, there are consequences. They will get timeouts. I assume if the National Socialist officials disobeyed, they would have been thrown in prison, or worse, maybe there was so much murdering going on at the time, maybe they themselves were facing life at risk. At any rate, though, in circumstances like in the business world, where CEOs or CFOs tell those under them to do fraudulent activities, by virtue of the hierarchical nature of the organizations of which they are members, it is typical for prosecutors and other government regulators in cleaning up the aftermath of those fraudulent activities to hold the employees hardly accountable at all or even not accountable at all, and to throw the book at the C-suite level executives, those who are higher up in the hierarchy, because they are the ones who were doing the modification of the will. They themselves were making the choices. Their wills were not modified. Only their employees under them were facing hierarchical direction. They themselves were free in the sense that Aristotle intended when he said that whenever we are free, we are fully responsible for our actions. So there you have it. Moral responsibility is something that seems intuitively to many ethicists over the centuries, it has seemed to be a function of our freedom and the freedom of the will. In circumstances in which we have that freedom, it is incumbent that we be held morally responsible, praised for good actions, condemned for bad ones, punished for really bad ones. And there are three kinds of modification of our responsibility that can be cited: modification by virtue of physical coercion, modification by virtue of ignorance, and modification by virtue of our wills being shaped by those in authority over us.